Imagine waking up at 3 a.m. to the sound of 50 U.S. fighter jets screaming across the Caribbean skyline. By the time you finish your morning coffee, the president of a sovereign nation, a man who defied the most powerful empire on earth for over a decade, is in handcuffs, being flown to a Florida detention center. This isn't a Tom Clancy novel or a Call of Duty mission. Why would the United States risk a global conflict to take down Venezuela in a lightning strike that lasted only 4 hours? The answer isn't just politics, it's a brutal, high-stakes lesson in macroeconomics that started with the very thing that was supposed to make Venezuela the richest country on the planet: oil. Hey guys, I'm Sean. Today we are breaking down the absolute insanity of the US invasion of Venezuela and the economic collapse that paved the way for it. In the next 40 minutes, we're going to peel back the layers of how a country with more oil than Saudi Arabia ended up with people weighing cash on meat scales just to buy a loaf of bread. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how the resource curse works, why the US finally pulled the trigger, and what this means for the future of global energy. This is a story of greed, catastrophic mismanagement, and the terrifying power of the US dollar. To understand why US Special Forces were rappelling onto the roof of the Miraflores Palace in 2026, we have to look at where Venezuela is and what sits beneath its soil. Look at the map. It's right at the top of South America, bordering Colombia and Brazil, with a stunning coastline along the Caribbean. It's a beautiful place, home to about 28 million people who speak Spanish and share a vibrant culture. But here is the kicker. Venezuela sits on the largest oil reserves in the world. We're talking over 300 billion barrels. Everyone thinks of the Middle East when they think of oil, but the undisputed king of crude is actually right here in our backyard. Now, you'd think having all that black gold would make you the Dubai of the West, right? And for a while it did. Back in the 1950s and all the way through the early 80s, Venezuela was the crown jewel of South America. They had a massive middle class, high-end European boutiques in Caracas, and a GDP per capita that made their neighbors look like they were standing still. They were producing more oil than almost anyone else as early as 1928. The government didn't even really need to tax the people. They just pumped money out of the ground. It was the ultimate cheat code for a nation. But here is where the devil's advocate comes in. Most people think having a massive natural resource is an automatic win. It's actually a trap called the Dutch disease, or the resource curse. Think of it like a kid who wins a 100 million lottery at age 18. Why would that kid go to college? Why would he learn a trade? Why would he start a business? He wouldn't. He'd just spend the lottery money. Venezuela did exactly that. Because oil was so easy, they stopped farming. They stopped building factories. Why sweat in a field to grow rice when you can just sell a barrel of oil and buy 5-star sushi from Japan? By the time the crisis hit, 96% of everything Venezuela sold to the world was just oil. They were a one-trick pony in a world that was about to change the rules of the game. Let's put this into a perspective we can all understand. Imagine you own a fried chicken shop. Business is booming. People are lining up around the block because you have the best recipe in town. You're making so much money that you decide you don't need to sell fries, you don't need to sell sodas, and you definitely don't need to fix the roof. You just sell chicken. But then two things happen. The price of chickens triples overnight, and suddenly everyone decides they want to go vegan. Because you didn't diversify, your shop doesn't just slow down, it vanishes. That is Venezuela in a nutshell. The contrast here is someone like Norway. They have tons of oil too, but instead of spending it all on a massive party, they put that money into a sovereign wealth fund, basically a giant national savings account. Today, that fund is worth over $1 trillion. They kept their tech sector and their fishing industry alive. So when oil prices drop, Norway just shrugs. Venezuela, on the other hand, didn't just spend the money. They bet their entire future on the price of oil staying at 100 forever. And as we saw in 2014 and again in 2025, that was a bet they were destined to lose. But how did a functional democracy turn into a regime that required a military intervention to topple? That started with a man named Hugo Chávez and a dream that turned into a nightmare. Before we dive into the rise of the socialist Bolivarian revolution and how it managed to destroy the most productive oil company in the world, I need to tell you about the secret meeting in 2007 that changed the relationship between Washington and Caracas forever. It involves the world's biggest oil CEOs and a very public get-out order that set the stage for the 2026 invasion. The year was 1999 and the world was terrified of the Y2K bug, but in South America, a different kind of system update was taking place. Enter Hugo Chávez. He didn't look like your typical politician. He was a former paratrooper with a red beret and a voice that could command a stadium of 100,000 people. He promised a socialism for the 21st century. To the poor, who felt ignored by the old elites, he was a messiah, and for a while it looked like he was pulling off a miracle. Between 2003 and 2011, oil prices didn't just go up, they rocketed to over $100 a barrel. Suddenly, the Venezuelan government was drowning in cash. Chávez did exactly what he promised. He poured billions into missions, massive social programs, free healthcare, free education, and subsidized food. If you were living in a slum in Caracas, your life genuinely improved. Poverty rates plummeted from 50% to under 30%. On the surface, it was a triumph. But if you looked at the engine room of the country, the PDVSA, the state-run oil company, the check engine light was flashing red, and the government was just putting a piece of black tape over it. You see, running an oil company isn't like running a lemonade stand. It requires incredible technical expertise, constant maintenance, and billions in reinvestment. But Chávez saw the PDVSA as a personal piggy bank for his political projects. In 2003, after a massive strike, he fired over 18,000 experienced oil workers and engineers, the literal brains of the industry, and replaced them with political loyalists. Their qualification? Not their ability to manage a refinery, but their loyalty to the revolution. Then came the 2007 showdown. Chávez looked at the massive American oil giants like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips, who were operating in the Orinoco Belt, and said, "Thanks for the technology, but we're taking the keys now." He nationalized their assets, the US companies were kicked out, and the message to the world was clear: your investments are not safe here. This was the moment the bridge to the West began to burn. Now, a lot of people think nationalization is a good thing, like, keep the wealth for the people, right? But here's the truth versus myth moment. While the oil belonged to the people on paper, the capacity to actually get it out of the ground was dying. Without the American engineers and the constant flow of new parts and technology, Venezuela's oil production began a slow, agonizing decline. They were sitting on a gold mine, but they had fired the miners and sold the shovels to pay for today's lunch. Think about it like this. You have a top-of-the-line Ferrari, it's the fastest car in the world, but instead of spending money on high-grade synthetic oil and expert mechanics, you decide to use the maintenance budget to buy pizza for the whole neighborhood. People love you for the pizza, but eventually the engine seizes up. Now you have no car, no way to get more pizza, and a neighborhood full of hungry people. That Ferrari was the PDVSA. By the time Chávez passed away in 2013 and handed the reins to his hand-picked successor, Nicolás Maduro, the price of oil was still high, but the cracks were becoming canyons. Maduro wasn't a charismatic paratrooper. He was a former bus driver with zero economic experience, and the universe was about to give him the worst possible welcome to the job. In 2000, the global oil market did something no one in Caracas thought was possible. It crashed. Hard. From $115 a barrel down to $30. Why? Because while Venezuela was busy firing its engineers, the United States was busy perfecting fracking. Suddenly, America was pumping more oil than ever before. The global supply skyrocketed and the price collapsed. Venezuela's only source of income, that 96% we talked about, was effectively cut in half overnight. This leads us to one of the most insane economic catastrophes in human history. When you run out of money, but you've promised everyone free stuff to stay in power, what do? You do the one thing that always leads to ruin. You turn on the money printer. But wait, before we get into the trillion bolivar loaf of bread and the terrifying hyperinflation that followed, I have to show you the specific moment the US Treasury Department realized they had a financial nuclear weapon that could bring Maduro to his knees without firing a single shot. It's the story of how a few lines of code in a New York bank became more dangerous than a predator drone. When the oil money dried up in 2014, Nicolás Maduro faced a choice: tell the people the party was over, or find a way to fake it. He chose to fake it. He ordered the Central Bank of Venezuela to start printing money, massive mountainous piles of it, to fund the government's promises. And this is where the laws of physics, or rather the laws of economics, caught up with him. Let's talk about hyperinflation. We've all felt a little sting when gas prices go up 10% or a burger costs an extra $1. That's normal inflation. But what happened in Venezuela was a total collapse of reality. By 2018, the inflation rate hit an eye-watering 65,000%. To put that in perspective for those of you in the US or Canada, imagine going to the grocery store on Monday and a gallon of milk is $4. By Friday, that same gallon is $40. By the end of the month, it's $4,000. Your life savings? The money your grandparents saved for 40 years? In a hyperinflationary environment, that money becomes literally worthless in weeks. It becomes cheaper to use the bills as wallpaper or napkins than to actually buy wallpaper or napkins. We saw videos of people in Caracas crafting handbags and bird-themed art out of currency because the paper was worth more as a material than as money. Now here's the devil's advocate angle. The government tried to blame speculators and economic warfare from the US. They even tried to fix the problem by just deleting zeros. In 2018, they launched the sovereign bolivar, which chopped 5 zeros off the old currency. It was like taking a $100,000 bill and writing 1 on it with a Sharpie. But guess what? It didn't work, because the government kept printing the new money just as fast as the old stuff. If you have 10 apples and 100 people with $1, the price of an apple is roughly $10. If you give everyone 1,000 but you still only have 10 apples, that apple is now $10,000. The problem wasn't the number of zeros, it was that there were no apples. The economy had stopped producing everything except oil, and the oil was failing. The human cost was devastating. This is where the story turns from numbers to tragedy. When your currency dies, the supply chain dies with it. Hospitals ran out of basic antibiotics. People began losing what became known as the Maduro diet, an average weight loss of 24 pounds per person across the country, because they simply couldn't afford to eat. This led to the Great Exodus. Since 2015, over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country. That is roughly 25% of the entire population. To give you an idea of the scale, that's like every single person in the state of Arizona or the entire population of the city of Toronto and its suburbs just packing a backpack and walking across the border. It is the largest displacement of people in the history of the Western Hemisphere. They weren't fleeing a war zone, at least not yet. They were fleeing a mathematical certainty of starvation. But while the people were fleeing, the Maduro regime was digging in. And they found a loophole. If they couldn't trade with the West, they'd trade with the shadow economy. They started selling blood gold, mining gold in the jungle under horrific conditions and flying it to places like Turkey and Iran to get cash. This is where the United States stepped in with a weapon more powerful than a Tomahawk missile, the SWIFT system. Washington realized that Maduro was staying alive by using the global banking network, so they cut him off. They froze the assets of the PDVSA in the US and told every bank in the world, if you help Maduro move his money, you will never do business in America again. But Maduro had one last card to play. He turned to the east. China and Russia saw an opportunity to gain a massive foothold right on America's doorstep. China started trading loans for oil, and Russia sent security advisors, mercenaries, to protect the presidential palace. Suddenly, Venezuela wasn't just a failing state, it was a front line in a new Cold War. As we move toward the final breaking point, we have to talk about the 2024 election. It was supposed to be the peaceful way out, but instead it became the spark that led to the 2026 invasion. You won't believe the level of voter fraud that was caught on camera, and how it pushed a certain former president in Washington to decide that enough was enough. By early 2024, the world thought they knew how the Venezuela story would end, slow, agonizing decline into a hermit state. But then came the July 28th presidential election. This was supposed to be the moment of truth. The opposition had united behind Edmundo Gonzalez, and every independent exit poll showed him winning by a landslide, nearly 70% of the vote. People were dancing in the streets, thinking the nightmare was over, but then the Maduro-controlled Electoral Council pulled a move that would make a movie villain blush. They simply declared Maduro the winner without showing a single tally sheet. No data, no proof, just a "trust me" from a regime that had already lied for a decade. The response was a wave of state-led repression so brutal it was labeled state terrorism by international human rights groups. For Washington, and specifically for a returning Donald Trump in 2025, this wasn't just a political dispute anymore. It was a direct challenge to American influence in the Western Hemisphere. Now, let's get into the devil's advocate side. Why did the US care this much? Critics say it was always about the oil. They argue the US used democracy as a cover to reclaim the Orinoco Belt, but the White House's official stance was far more aggressive. They categorized Maduro as the leader of a narco-terrorist organization. They claimed that by allowing Colombian guerrillas and drug cartels to run wild, Maduro was essentially launching a kinetic assault on the American people via the fentanyl and cocaine crisis. In their eyes, the 2026 strike wasn't an invasion, it was a massive drug bust with 150 fighter jets. This set the stage for the Dawn Row Doctrine, a 2020 pivot in U.S. foreign policy. It was a 21st century version of the Monroe Doctrine, basically telling China and Russia, get out of our neighborhood. The U.S. started with a naval blockade in late 2025, stopping every Venezuelan tanker in the Caribbean. If you were carrying Maduro's oil, you were a target. By December, the tensions weren't just high, they were at a boiling point. And then the order was given. At 11:46 p.m. on January 2nd, 2026, the green light for Operation Absolute Resolve was lit. This was a masterclass in modern military precision. The goal wasn't to occupy every city, it was to decapitate the leadership. U.S. Special Forces had reportedly rehearsed this for months, knowing everything down to Maduro's favorite pet and what he ate for dinner. At 2:00 a.m. on January 3rd, the sky over Caracas lit up. 7 massive explosions rocked military headquarters and intelligence centers, while the Venezuelan anti-aircraft systems were being jammed into oblivion by EA-18G Growlers. Black Hawk helicopters were already landing in the heart of the capital. In less than 4 hours, the man who had survived a dozen coup attempts and countless sanctions was in U.S. custody, flying toward a federal court in Manhattan. Think about the sheer speed of that. Most wars take years. This took a morning. But the real shock came afterward. Trump didn't just say we're leaving. He announced from Mar-a-Lago that the U.S. would run Venezuela temporarily. He promised to bring in U.S. oil companies to fix the pipes and use the profits to pay for the mission. It was the Pottery Barn rule on a global scale. You break it, you own it. But as the dust settles in early 2026, the question remains, can you actually fix a country with a military strike? While some Venezuelans are cheering in the streets of Miami and Caracas, others are calling it a brutal aggression. The Chinese are furious, the Russians are silent, and the global oil market is holding its breath. Before we wrap this up with the ultimate lesson on why this matters for your wallet and the future of the world, we need to look at the immediate aftermath. What does a US-run Venezuela look like on day one? And is this the start of a new era where the US becomes the world's landlord? As the sun rose over Caracas on January 4th, 2026, the world woke up to a reality that felt like a glitch in the Matrix. Maduro and his inner circle were no longer in the presidential palace. Instead, they were being processed in a federal facility in the United States. Meanwhile, back in Venezuela, the interim leadership was left in an impossible position, trying to balance national pride with the cold reality of needing to negotiate with Washington just to keep the lights on and the water running. The immediate aftermath was a chaotic mix of raw emotion. In the heart of the Venezuelan diaspora in Florida, thousands of people flooded the streets, waving flags and crying because, for them, this was the end of a 25-year exile. But inside Venezuela, the situation was far more delicate. While a massive U.S. armada remained poised in the Caribbean, a strict quarantine was established over the ports. The message was clear: no oil goes out and no supplies come in unless the United States clears the manifest. This is the ultimate leverage. Now let's look at the actual strategy the U.S. is calling the Venezuela Restoration Plan. The first priority is a total energy overhaul. President Trump has been very clear that American oil giants are being fast-tracked to enter the Orinoco Belt. The goal is to jumpstart production from its current pathetic levels back to 3 million barrels a day. According to the White House, every cent of that revenue will be used to pay off the country's massive $200 billion international debt. Next comes the humanitarian surge. Thousands of tons of food and medicine that were blocked for years by political standoffs are finally crossing the borders. The U.S. is betting that if they can fill the stomachs of the people, the appetite for any kind of counter-revolution will vanish. Finally, there is the judicial cleanup. By framing the capture of Maduro as a narco-terrorism arrest rather than a political move, Washington is attempting to bypass the international law arguments being screamed by China and Russia at the United Nations. But we have to look at the other side of this. Critics are already calling this the Putinization of American foreign policy. They argue that by unilaterally removing a head of state and claiming the right to manage their resources, the U.S. has effectively demolished the rule of law. China, which holds a massive amount of Venezuelan debt and was receiving 80% of their oil exports just months ago, sees this as a direct theft of their energy security, we are looking at a geopolitical powder keg. If China decides to protect its interests, or if the Venezuelan military decides to wage a guerrilla war from the jungles, this 4-hour victory could turn into a 10-year quagmire. So, how do we navigate a world where a superpower can simply evict a country's leadership? First, keep your eyes on the oil ticker. If Venezuela's 300 billion barrels hit the market under American management, global gas prices could plummet, which would be a massive deflationary event for the West. Second, monitor the new Cold War. The real conflict isn't in the streets of Caracas, so it's in the diplomatic halls of Beijing and Moscow. Watch for retaliatory cyber attacks or trade wars, and finally learn the lesson of diversification. As we saw with the total collapse of the bolivar, being all in on one single asset is a recipe for disaster when the global rules of the game change overnight. What we've witnessed in the last 48 hours is the ultimate conclusion of a nation that forgot the most basic rule of survival. Do not put all your eggs in one basket. Venezuela started with the greatest treasure on earth and ended up as a cautionary tale for the ages. They bet on $100 oil, they bet on a money printer to solve their problems, and they bet that the world would never have the nerve to actually come for them. They were wrong on all three counts. The capture of Maduro in February 2026 wasn't just about one man. It was the moment the United States reasserted that the Western Hemisphere is not a playground for rival powers. Whether you see this as a liberation or a dangerous aggression, the economic reality remains that the world's largest oil reserves are now effectively under the management of Washington. The question now is, what happens next? Will the 7 million refugees finally go home and rebuild, or has a Pandora's box of regional instability been opened? One thing is certain: the era of the resource curse has claimed its biggest victim yet, and the ripples are just beginning to reach our shores. If you want to understand how this massive shift in oil production is going to affect your wallet and the global economy next month, you need to see my next breakdown on the death of OPEC. Trust me, you don't want to miss that one. Let me know in the comments if you think this was a necessary move or a step too far. I'm Sean, and I'll see you in the next one.